we need to talk about Kurt Rosenwinkel. So Kurt Rosenwinkel, probably the most important musician for a lot of musicians in my generation. I guess more on the jazz side of things, but you hear, even people in other sort of areas like rock or other things like Tosin Abasi, Rick Beato made a video about him too recently. Kurt was just this sort of inevitable figure if you're about my age. I'm 39 right now. And back in 2005, even earlier than that, I guess he was still very much around. Back in 2005, I'm going to give you my Kurt Rosenwinkel recollection here to the best of my abilities, and how I remember it, you know what I mean? Because he was definitely a major influence on me, a major presence in my life, something I moved away from eventually, as I think we all should with our heroes. But it was definitely very important to me, and I think very important to music in general, and to jazz especially, jazz guitar maybe. Back in 2005, I started being serious about music when I was in my 20s. I started studying with a teacher back in Brazil called Lupa Santiago, and I remember him showing me, I believe it was Enemies of Energy, or maybe, I think the first one that I ever listened to was Enemies of Energy, and I remember not really getting it at first. Back then I was very much like, I guess I was in that little, like, there were a lot of Metheny records that were important to me. Well, not a lot. Bright Size Life, there was a trio live with Larry Grenadier and Bill Stewart. I dug some Scofield wasn't super big in my book. It became much bigger later on. All the more older school guys, like Wes was already pretty big in my head. Benson was there for sure. But I get, there was a lot of Dave Holland's work too. Like the Dave Holland Quintet was pretty important. Some of what Chris Potter was doing. But I guess it's sort of, he came in at a special time where he's sort of feeling a void for me. As it pertains to like a contemporary jazz guitar reference for me. I didn't really have something to really gravitate to at that point in my life, and Kurt arrived right on that time. So I remember when I started getting more into it, forgive me, it was, I think, I was sort of like, started listening to Enemies of Energy. Then at one point, I stumbled upon Deep Song that I think had just come out around that time. Maybe it was a little bit before 2005. I'm gonna do the research. I'll put it in the info here in the video. And that one really grabbed me. Deep Song was probably the first one that really made Kurt sort of accessible to me. Something about the aesthetic of Enemies of Energy at first, which now I really love, but at first wasn't super friendly to me. Maybe just the way it was recorded and the tunes were really angular. I wasn't really ready for that yet. I think Deep Song was just friendly enough that really got me in. The guitar was like superbly recorded, which was also great. Then I went back a little bit, started checking out some of Next Step, for sure, like another huge record. I remember when I first put that CD in and I heard that I was doing like a little mock Zhivago intro here, forgive me, you know what I mean? I never really played that tune in my life, but I was like, it'd be nice to have a little intro, And he wrote it in a different tuning, which I wasn't using. So you hear that really low E flat, and I don't have that on standard tuning. But I wanted to do a little homage to start the video up. That intro just really blew my mind in terms of like, it just sounded like nothing else that I was hearing around at that time. Nobody was really playing guitar like that or writing music like that, I think more crucially, you know what I mean? And I'm gonna make a little parenthesis here because I was coming in, I really started falling in love with music for real towards, the end of my high school years. I started discovering a little bit more, like I was really into progressive rock, like Yes was a huge band for me. Steve Howe as a guitar player, and a few other things, older, the classic rock things. But I guess, coming from Yes, like just their compositions and the unorthodox way that they played sort of led me on to sort of fusion things and all that. I remember I had a huge Mahavishnu orchestra phase in high school. started getting into Miles Electric. Like I remember like just seeing in the record store. I mean, record stores were so cool at that point. It was awesome. I saw the cover to Bitches Brew, and I just thought the cover just was so awesome. That record had to be good because it was such a cool cover, right? And just the fact that the band was immense and they had two drummers and all that. Anyway, that was kind of what I was coming from. And when I started studying jazz more seriously, it almost felt like, you know, that wasn't what I was used to. Of course, you're checking out Wes, and like I remember, you know, my first Wes record was Dynamic New Sound, which is a wonderful record, you know, and then eventually Incredible Jazz Guitar. Even Matheny had a little bit more of that, but like there was definitely a big sort of change in terms of the repertoire. Like it was a lot more like the straight ahead stuff with the standards wasn't really, even though it was harmonically sophisticated, it wasn't really what I was listening to before, and just sounded a little more old-fashioned. I'm gonna put that really carefully because I've grown to really love that tradition, and all that stuff is actually super hip. But not to use a jazz word there, but you know, it just wasn't what I was listening to aesthetically. You know what I'm saying? So Rosenwinkel came in, and his guitar sounded super powerful and had delay on it, and it didn't get in the way of things. And the compositions he was playing, like Zhivago, Minor Blues, Use of Light, all those songs were so interesting. They sounded just so. I remember listening to like on Deep Song, like The Cross. It was just so exciting. It was like the solos were super great. You know what I mean? He had all this stuff together in like another really evocative thing of Kurt's is like he definitely has checked out tradition and all that, but what he was playing didn't sound traditional. It sounded forward thinking. It sounded like he checked everybody out, but he was doing like the stuff that he was playing was coming out of the songs that he was writing, and the songs that he was writing were informing his playing in other forms. You know, it was almost like the composition was feeding into the playing into the composition, and he had this totally interesting and kind of unique vocabulary. There was so pleasant to my ears, so refreshing, I think is the word that I was looking for. You know what I mean? It was really cool to hear. And you know, everybody in the bands, you know, like Mark and him and Mark, like they just played. I mean, you've heard this, you know, they played so together. And Ben Street, Jeff Ballard, which is one of those bands that you just can't, you know what I mean? And then Deep Song, you had Brad Mehldau joining, you know. At that point, hardcore became a much bigger record for me in the future. And by the way, if you haven't checked out those records that I'm mentioning here, I'll list them in the description of the video. Definitely check all those records. I'll have the discography listed because I'm mentioning them all in passing fast here, you know. But those records got big for me. The big two records here at that time were The Next Step and Deep Song, I guess, was really checking out. You know, of course, East Coast Love Affair was already out, Intuit was already out, Enemies of Energy. People had, there were copies of the Under It All, like bootleg, kind of floating around. I didn't really have that, and you know, but those two records, Next Step and Deep Song, really kind of gave me this sort of like contemporary hero and aesthetic to look up to and to sort of like guide, you know, like a North Star in the seas of jazz guitar for me at that point. You know, I remember he had there was a time that he had this forum on his website, like back in the internet's more innocent days. It was the Kurt Rosenwinkel forum, and I used to make, because it was in Brazil, right? So I was so hungry for any kind of information about what was going on. And, you know, I'd go to the forum, there was a bunch of different guitar players and other musicians. Kurt would post every once in a while and get into conversation with people, which was so gracious and kind of awesome. And I discovered, you know, the Brown Blade Fellowship, even the Bad Plus, and other Esbjorn's Vesen Trio, Fly, all those things I started hearing about through Guillermo Klein and Los Guachos. I started discovering those through the Kurt Rosenwinkel forum, which was actually super fun. And I eventually got to meet some of the people that were in the forum, which was also great. You know, I mean, that thing, I think eventually that website kind of fell through, and as it is, you know, they got a whole reworked, and also maybe forums got a little bit more out of style as the internet got more social media oriented. But that was another super great source of material, and conversation. And then, I was waiting. I was really expecting sort of like what's gonna be the next thing, like because Deep Song was out, and I was like, what's the next record? What's the next record gonna be like? And I didn't really know. And then I saw that Kurt was recording a live album at the Vanguard, and there was a website back then called Artist Share, which is like it was basically an artist funding website for artists to fund their albums directly. You know what I mean? At that point, I didn't know about any of this, but Kurt wasn't working with the label anymore. He was on his own. And he was trying to fund, his record. I mean, not trying to fund, but I think sell more direct to customer his album, which ended up being The Remedy. I jumped at it, I was like, whatever he's making, I mean, I'm sure it's gonna be great. And then he came to my house, like this double. I think I still was in Brazil when I got it. I'm pretty sure. And then it was this double live record, black and red, and just the fact that it was like a double record, it got the prog boy in me all excited and stuff. And I didn't know what to expect. I thought I was expecting more of Deep Song, but what hit me was just insane. It was insane. I remember listening to that album for the first time. The intro to chords, how Goldberg comes in with those, and then Harlan comes in with that shit. I was like, what is this? I loved it from the first listen. And when he comes in with the melody, it's so, then the melody it gets busy with Mark doubling. His solo just like right off the gate, crazy, like insane, you know what I mean? All the tunes, like Safe Corners, View from Moscow, but I gotta see, let me default on the, it's been a minute since I've heard that. The Remedy, that little intro, just to remember it. It was so cool. Like that album was the big one for me. I think that album was the big Kurt Rosenwinkel record for me. It was so amazing. It was like the guitar tone was different. He was playing with more overdrive, and that's one of the key aspects of Kurt that I think boggles the mind. The way he writes music is so particular, and the way he works his tone. It's funny, not that I'm against using that word, but it's never fusion. It's sort of like the whole thing is this acoustic quartet, and then he has this electric guitar that's got delay and verb and overdrive, and he's singing along the lines, but still, like, it doesn't feel like a fusion album. It feels jazz. It feels like it belongs perfectly in an acoustic environment. So one of the things that I'm craziest about Kurt is that he made guitar for a while there really cool again. He made it fit in the acoustic jazz context in a very classy and modern way, which was amazing to me, and I'm sure to many of my peers. It was such an exciting thing to listen to. That album became like a sort of a guiding light. I did the whole fanboy thing. I bought a D'Angelico NYSS 3B. Mine was amber, great guitar. I bought a Line 6 DL4, bought a Polytone. Those things weren't actually that expensive. You could find them somewhere. I eventually bought a Rat, and I think like everybody, even when I got to Berkeley, I had the guitar on me. I started wearing a hat. The whole thing, man. Honestly, listen. I think it's cute. At one point of your life, it's acceptable, right? You want to be like your heroes. And I was in college and all that stuff. It was all fine. I think the other thing to me is that, even though I was a huge fan, I never really set out to sort of like, not set out, but I don't think I was ever very successful at like copying Kurt, actually. It was like, I checked out some of the tunes, but they were so daunting to me. I thought that I couldn't possibly grasp like what was going on. It was so scary to me. Like I didn't think I could make sense. Of course you can, it's just tunes, right? But like, it just seemed too much to try to get into it. You know what I mean? I transcribed a few solos, quite a few solos, but it doesn't really matter if you don't get the context and all that. You know what I mean? I think I was always a poor imitator of Kurt Rosenwinkel, and honestly, all for the best. Because eventually, let me continue anyway. He continued releasing really, really cool albums with really, interesting compositions that were always sort of informing everybody around, and I really felt like, you know what I mean, like reading about his generation back at Smalls, which was already past my time, like what was going on in New York. I thought that what I was going to be moving into once I, went to Berkeley and left Boston, went to New York, was going to be sort of an evolution of that scene, a continuation of that stuff that was going on in the late 90s, early 2000s. In a way it was, in another way it wasn't, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. I think as we're talking about Kurt Rosenwinkel, I think his approach, if not necessarily verbatim, his playing and all that, his approach to composition and tone, it sort of inspired me to create like my thing, you know what I mean? Like at one point it just got so, I was like, I did my first album, and then when I was in New York, I connected to some of the players. I mean, it's inevitable. Like a lot of the guys, I'd play with them, and the band, like to my album 1954, is almost basically the Remedy band. It doesn't have Mark, but it has Aaron Parks instead of Aaron Goldberg. But then, Joe and Eric Harlan are the bass and drum duo there. And I honestly, like that was my dream, rhythm section. Eventually, my next album involved Mark. At that point I was playing Smalls. And like with that, it comes another thing that it might be a little tougher to talk about. You start thinking, like, or at least I started thinking, like how close is too close? You know what I'm saying? Like I knew of a lot of players that sound a lot closer to Kurt than I did. I think back then I wish I sounded closer. But at the same time, like, and did my tunes sound like Kurt tunes? I don't think they did. I still don't think they do. I was definitely playing with musicians that were associated with them. I was playing instruments that were associated with them. The D'Angelico at first. Then I started working with a company called Westville Guitars, which was really great to me. I appreciate Masaki Nishimura from Westville to this day. I don't play Westville anymore. And we'll hear that story another time, because it was part of the leaving Kurt Rosenwinkel behind moment, which I think is healthy for everybody. You know what I mean? Not whoever your Kurt Rosenwinkel is. I was at that point. It was funny. I'll tell you a little anecdote. At one point, it was 2 days before I recorded 1962. Was my third album. This must have been 2018. I was playing at Smalls on a Monday, and I was recording the album on a Wednesday and on a Thursday, like 2 days after, right? So my whole band was booked, and Kurt was starting the Vanguard that week on a Tuesday, and Masaki Nishimura was from Westville, was in town. He was gonna hang with Kurt at the Vanguard, and he was gonna come to my recording session. I was playing my Westville at that time. Kurt was playing his. And I just remember going to, like, the band had been playing the tunes, and we had that small show, and I remember just gonna run the stuff. Mark couldn't make it; he missed his flight, but he was gonna make that recording session. And I remember going into Smalls and setting up, and we played the first set, and then Masaki was there, Nishimura from Westville, and he said to me, I called Kurt, he's coming down. And I was like, what? I'm like, Masaki, you're crazy. Like, you called him here. How am I gonna play in front of Kurt Rosenwinkel? And he, I started freaking out. I went to the back of Smalls, the little back room there, and I was just sitting there, and just like Kevin Hayes was sitting back there too. And I was just thinking to myself, I'm like, man, he's coming, like the guy. And I'm like, I had to play a second set, and he's gonna be here. Am I gonna be able to play a single note? You know what I mean? Because I'm playing with this rhythm section that he used to use, and I started feeling so self-conscious about things. When I'm stepping out, of course the mind tells a different story. But that's probably not what happened. But in terms of synchronicity, I know most of this happened. So it's coming out, and I saw him coming downstairs. Probably wasn't that synchronicus or whatever at the same time. And he comes down, and he's pretty tall, and I'm like, I see Kurt, and I'm like, hey man, thanks for coming down. I was like, oh man, of course. And then I'm like, I think I said something like, no pressure, right? And then he said, just, get there and play, whatever, some break a leg. It was some comment. And I remember going, and I had a terrible set. It was a terrible, terrible set. I played really badly in front of the guy, packed house at Smalls too. It was a crazy band. I felt really bad. I felt like it really wasn't my night. And at the end, there's nothing you can say, you know, to justify it. And I went back and, you know, cheers, Kurt, you were really nice. He was just like, he asked me, I remember him asking me, you know, like, you playing here often? And I'm like, no, you know, every now and then. But you know, it's my most special place to play. It's the coolest club I get to play ever, and whenever it does happen, I'm always, you know, I try to do my best. And then he was like, yeah, man, cheers, it was cool. And you know, I don't know, I'd probably just say it was cool, but you know, he said, let me buy you a drink. And I said, no, I'll buy you a drink. I mean, for all the years of, you know. And you know, since then, recording the album went really great, much better than, maybe bad show, good recording, I don't know. I'm still, you know, grateful he came and grateful he was nice to me. He couldn't, you know, he might not have been, but he was really cool. And you know, did the recording. And at one point, man, it's funny how these things go. You know, you always try to remember. You start, you know, because I was taking lessons from Mark at NYU, Mark Turner, and then he was in the album. But at one point, man, you just start feeling, you start hearing other things, and you start, you know, you see like the direction that they take to, and I think that's another point, maybe the final point of Kurt's that I'm gonna make. You can tell he's a guy that will never stop evolving. He's always moving. The way his sound is now isn't the way it was before, and it isn't the way that it's gonna be later. Every time with him, I have a feeling he's looking for something different, and that's amazing. I think that's a huge prop to Kurt Rosenwinkel. And I felt like it was my time to follow my own muse too. You know, I was looking for a different sound. I was looking for a different instrument, you know, which led me to, you know, a different guitar. I had to get rid of my Westfield, and there'll be a video about that guitar very soon. There was a much more acoustic instrument, and that what I felt would cater more to the sound that I was looking for, which wasn't Kurt's sound. And I think that's one thing that's important, you know. I haven't done a new album yet, but I think at one point we have to leave our heroes behind a little bit. They're wonderful, but like I remember Wayne Krantz saying, you know, like, I'm a grown man. Am I supposed to sound like another grown man? And I see that with a lot of respect. It's sort of like, yeah, man, it's, you know, it's time to move away from Kurt. Time to find what speaks to you, you know. And it's been like that. The 55 bar was a place. Once it kind of worked out at the same time that my first gig at the 55 was my last gig with the Westville, and then I started playing, you know, a different guitar that was very much the 55 bar guitar in those years after that, you know. And it became very much my voice. This is a new instrument. I brought it. It's more similar to that aesthetic, that the semi-hollow guitar I brought out for this video too. Which it has a different voice for me that I love it too. It's very recent, but I thought I'd use it for the intro because it has more of that Kurt. You know, it can do more of that Kurt thing that the other guitar doesn't really. It's not really that guitar's bag. But I think it was, you know, it was all wonderful, and now even as I sort of follow, you know, I still check Kurt out, and though not as much as I did, you know, back in the day, I'm very grateful for everything he did for jazz guitar in general, and for the scene. I'm somewhat disappointed because it seems like disappointed is a strong word, but I feel like people should have. I wish my generation and my peers had taken more advantage of that generation and kind of like stood on their shoulders a little bit and continued that aesthetic a little bit more. Kind of very original music, very compositional, kind of forward-thinking stuff. You know, it seems like things right now are in a kind of a straight-ahead kick, which is great. You know, I'm not gonna hate on that. Everything has its place. But you know, that was the thing that I really loved, and maybe fall in love with jazz, and then go back and, you know, find out all the little, how, you know, just to extrapolate how Bud Powell fits into Kurt Rosenwinkel, how like bebop belongs in that music, which it really does, and it made me love jazz to the point that I would go back and really love the jazz that I didn't grow up with. You know, I don't know if that made sense, but like contemporary jazz made me love hard bop, bebop, swing. It's sort of like, it was the entryway, and I feel like it's as important as, you know, and in my part, I'd like to continue that tradition a little bit, and I've tried to do that. I think even at my most, you know, Kurt fan, like, days, my stuff, I stand by it. I think he never got close enough. It is very much my music. I don't think it sounds like Kurt. You know, yeah, that's my spiel about that. Kurt Rosenwinkel, thank you very much for everything. You're still a super badass. I got a couple more Kurt stories. Maybe I'll tell one day. All great. Some was really funny actually. And yeah, I hope to see you guys very soon on the next video. And let me know if you have thoughts on Kurt Rosenwinkel, contemporary jazz guitar, whatever you say. You know what I mean? I had to do the Kurt video and give the man his props. And yeah, let's all carry on finding out how we sound. Thank you very much. If you dig this video, like, subscribe, send me your comments, tell me who you like, why don't you like them, and yeah, I'll see you soon. Thank you.